record this Zoom for anybody that's not able to join us this evening. And there should be some time when we're done viewing those videos, if you guys would like to have some conversation about it, or just have some specific questions about some of the topics or content that's covered in these videos. So let's do that. And then just also a reminder that as you guys are moving through assignments, if something's unclear or you need additional help, please feel free to reach out to me. I put some assigned office hours on the syllabus, but you are not limited to that. We can set them up whenever. And I've heard already from, I don't know, like 5 to 8 of you with various questions and whatnot, and met with a couple of folks that had some need for assistance. So just know that if you're struggling or you just need a little more clarity, please send me a text or an email, and I will do my best to answer your questions. And if I can't, we'll set up a Zoom office hour so we can walk through things together in that way. Sound okay? All righty. I am going to share screen.
We're taking notes on these videos, right?
Oh, thank you for bringing that up. Yeah, there is an assignment attached to this within the module. So basically just take some notes so that I know that you either participated this evening or you're watching the video, you know, that coincides better with your schedule, so that I know that you heard the content.
Are you looking for anything specific in them, like how detailed or?
I would just as you would, like if you were sitting in a class and taking lecture notes. So, you know, it doesn't need to be a thesis or an essay. It's truly like an outline so that I know, you know what I mean? That's what I'm looking for. You listened, and I can tell from looking at your notes that you did listen. So the key points and supporting details. Is that enough clarity, or do you need to speak more to that?
That's great, thank you.
Okay.
Is that the assignment that says that has yesterday's date on it?
Yep.
Okay.
I fixed that though. Now it says today's date. And I believe it's not due till October 10th, if I'm remembering that right. So it's not like you have to do it right away.
Hello, hi there. I'm Camille Henderson, an ESA school psychologist. I've been a school psychologist for, this is my 13th year. And we're here to talk to you about some of the stuff that we handle and look at every day as school psychologists. I'm Krista Starkey Brown, and I've worked with Camille here at the ESA as a school psychologist. So we figured we would kind of go through the evaluation process and kind of highlight some of the things that you would want to know as teachers. And then we talk about, you know, some of the—
Oh, it's okay. I was struggling with those.
To give you a good idea. So I'm going to start by talking about kind of the pre-referral process. So, you know, if you're a teacher and you have a concern about a student, you know, you're going to want to have a process in the building set up, and they'll tell you what that is. And each building is different. You're going to have levels of intervention. And if you haven't already had classes about that, I'm sure that you will. So if you have a student that you're concerned about, there's usually some kind of team in the building that you would want to, you know, contact: an intervention team, child study team. There are different systems in different schools, what they call it, RTI, MTSS. And you're going to go to your team and make a referral so that you can get you can meet with people and talk about, you know, the problem that you're seeing, whether it's behavior, whether it's reading, whether it's math, something like that, academic, and come up with kind of a plan for that student so you can implement some interventions and see if they make progress. Because you have to do that before, you know, you go right to a special ed referral. So that is what you would do to begin when you have a concern. And after you've implemented those interventions and, it's been a few months and you're meeting with your intervention team and looking at that data and you're not seeing, a lot of progress, then that might be the point where you're going to agree, okay, maybe we need to talk about a special ed referral. And typically, you might want to, just depends on the school that you're at, bring the administrator, like principal, into that conversation, touch base with your school psychologist. And before you say, oh, school psychologist, here's my referral, and contact the parent, you're going to want to contact, the parent yourself and let them know your concerns. And hopefully you've been having that, ongoing conversation anyway, and say, okay, I'm thinking that special education referral would be appropriate at this time. And we want the parent, to be on board before a stranger like me gives them a call about a special ed evaluation. So that's kind of the pre-referral process. It really is systematic in most buildings, and it looks a little different, but that's how I end up with my evaluations. Is there anything else, Camille, that you can think of?
It's so dependent on what eligibility or what concern you're looking at, which is why this conversation moves really nicely into our outlining the areas that we might be evaluating. So hello. Hi there. I'm Camille Henderson, an ESA school psychologist. I've been a school.
Any questions, guys, based on just that one little introductory snippet?
Nope.
Okay, sounds good. So as soon as this loads. Sorry that I did not have time to make this into one video, and they were not able to send it to me as one video, but hopefully during this module, I'll compress this and put it into one video and share it out that way. So if you want to review it again later, it'll hopefully be a little easier to navigate through.
So I often have the conversation with families that our menu for special education eligibility is not like a diagnostic manual that a doctor or a different mental health care professional outside of the school system might have, meaning that we only have a few different areas that we look at as opposed to everything that we might diagnose a kid with, which is why sometimes educational eligibilities and medical diagnoses don't quite match. So when we look at all the things that we might be evaluating for, there are several that don't really apply to us as school psychologists. Things like vision impairment, hearing impairment, physical impairment. Those are things that are evaluated by other professionals. The most common thing that our preschoolers come to us with is a speech and language eligibility. And very often that's kind of the gateway into special education services for young children because it's the first thing that we can measure. And it helps us measure that there's a concern and get some intervention in before a kid could sit for like a classic cognitive test or things like that. So very often, and I do most of the preschool evaluations around here, it happens that a child has an eligibility like speech and might be receiving some services. And then I come in and do some extra testing after it's clear that after some intervention, the concern might be bigger than that. So one of the ways that kids can qualify for special education is a cognitive impairment. That's the way we measure that is there's an IQ test, which we'll be showing you in a little while. And a student needs to achieve a standard score of 70 or below, in addition to a reading and math assessment where they score at or below the 6th percentile. We'll be talking about some of those assessments too. And then we're also looking for impairments in daily living skills, things like that. And we'll be talking about those as well. So that's kind of the backbone of measuring and proving that we have a school need related to cognition.
And I would add that those are the kids you're going to know immediately. Like if you get a kindergartner that has not been receiving services, you will know immediately that they are extremely delayed. They aren't missed typically if they're in school full time.
That's often true, although sometimes with a mild cognitive impairment and high adaptive skills relative to a young child, we miss those sometimes when they're little because those difficulties show up as academics get tougher. Which is also true of a specific learning disability. So there are lots of ways in which districts measure this, and there are different models. So the one that's most commonly used now is a pattern of strengths and weaknesses. There are several areas that the state outlines that we might be looking at. So let's see if I can rattle those off the top of my head. There's reading comprehension, reading fluency, reading decoding, math computation, math reasoning, and written expression. And then there's also auditory comprehension, so understanding what you're hearing, and then oral expression, so the ability to use language. So the way that we evaluate fluency.
Reading fluency.
Did I say reading fluency?
Yeah.
Crud.
Maybe, I don't know.
So,
There's a lot.
There's a lot. So what we do is we give that academic assessment that we'll be talking about. So an assessment of all of those areas, in addition to looking at the data that already exists. So grades, performance on standardized tests, teacher input, some observation in the classroom that looks at how on task they are during areas that are a concern and areas that aren't a concern. We could examine work samples. There's a file review where we look at, all of the existing information, and then we kind of plot out where the difficulties rise and fall. We can use some other scores like an IQ test if we need to, because sometimes the data isn't as clean as we would like it to be, meaning that, we have a couple areas where a few of our data points say there's a difficulty, but some of the data points look okay and things like that. And every district has its own policy as to exactly what data points they're using, what the cutoffs for those are to say that this is a strength and say that this is a weakness. And that's something that is district specific, but generally looks, within a few points of the same thing.
The more data you have for your school psychologist,
the happier we'll be.
Yeah, the happier, the easier the evaluation
Right.
will go.
Which is why we talked about the pre-referral process a little bit. Yes. Another evaluation that we commonly do is one for autism. And so that one, whereas usually when we're evaluating for like a learning disability or a cognitive impairment, we kind of run the evaluation on our own. That's really a team evaluation. So the law says that we need to have a social worker and a speech therapist because autism is a social and communication disorder. So there are several different areas that we're looking at and several different pieces of that evaluation. A lot of that evaluation is done with rating scales that look at different parts of daily functioning and behavior. And again, we'll be showing you some of those in a little bit. And then lots of observation where we're not only looking at time on task like we would be for other more academically based evaluations. We're also looking at the quality and type of social interaction that we're seeing depending on what the environmental expectation is. So for example, I might go hang out in a preschool classroom and I would code story time very differently than playtime, for example, but both of those things are important. Looking at a variety of different situations that a kid might be in and a variety of circumstances and skills. So another piece that we often do is an ADOS. So that is it's called an Autism Diagnostic Observation Schedule. And that looks a little bit more like play, and we'll be showing you that. But it's a more standardized autism assessment that gives you kind of the likelihood that you're looking at autism, as well as measures the severity of that. And it's also one of those tests that kind of lives everywhere in the world, meaning that if a child goes to a hospital or another place to be evaluated for autism, it's likely they'll encounter that as well. For example, if a child receives applied behavior analysis, that's used to measure progress and is given periodically. So it's nice when our tests speak the same language and we can kind of talk to each other between disciplines. And autism is one of those areas where there's a lot of information flying around. So it's nice to be able to capture some of that data that's useful for everyone. So in an autism evaluation, for example, the social worker might come in, might do a home visit, not anymore so much during the COVID times, but in general, we like to see a kid where they're most comfortable and where they like to be.
In preschool.
But most of my autism evaluations and the brunt of them happen in preschool. Of course, it's common that a kid shows up in elementary school without any services because his parents weren't aware or for a variety of reasons. So sometimes those kids are caught in early elementary school as well. So during that home visit, my favorite story about home visit is we went to a house and they said, oh, we don't have any concerns. He loves to play, plays with a lot of stuff. He's got a great imagination. Everything's fine. So we walked in and there was like a Lego tower, like a giant Lego tower. Like I don't think they sell kits that big. It was like a lot of time and very intricate work. And it was in front of the TV. So, you couldn't move the Lego tower because it would have resulted in some very upset behavior by the student. And so I was able to say like, tell me about that. What's going on there? And so there's a lot of data that like things you wouldn't even think to ask had you not seen. So helpful to be able to do some of those things as an evaluator, but again, not necessary because we're doing a school evaluation. So measuring what we see at school is sufficient. So with an autism evaluation, we also have like a developmental history where we're going back and looking at pregnancy, early childhood, developmental milestones, and those things, because part of the autism criteria is related to having a delay or having a regression. And when did these things start? Did I miss anything with autism?
I don't think so.
Yeah.
Very
So,
multidisciplinary.
yeah, those
we
are
will
like
be in your room hanging out. So we're the social worker because so much of it is observation based. So
right.
We will be in there.
And then we have a big team meeting at the end of it where we all sit down and review our autism criteria. So there's 3 buckets that autism criteria fall in. There's social skills, there's communication skills, and there's restricted repetitive stereotype skills. And those are things that are specific to kids with autism that we don't see in a lot of other people. And there's specific things we're looking for there. And so as we meet as a team, we go over those things in our data, and these poor reports and these poor parents, they're like 15 pages long. But it's a lot of good information, and there's a wide breadth of things we're looking at. So it makes sense.
Well, and like you said before, that is one of the areas we get a lot of, well, they have this medical diagnosis, we went and got them tested at the clinic and they said that they have autism. And it's just important to know as teachers that if a parent tells you that, it's not going to mean that they meet special education criteria. We have more stringent criteria. We do more comprehensive evaluations actually than they can do in just a clinical setting versus what we can see, socially or in the home, and at school. So that's just something, for you to remember in the future. If you have a parent come to you and say, my kid has autism, this is what U of M said, so, I want special ed. It's just important that you don't say something like, oh, okay, they'll definitely get services
right away.
Or whatever.
We're on it.
It's a process.
Yeah, well, the medical criteria for autism and our eligibility criteria are mostly the same, a little bit different now that they've updated the DSM. We also have to prove that there's a education need on top of meeting the criteria. And like Krista said, you don't go into a hospital and get diagnosed the same day after a couple hours of testing. We get to come back and come back and come back and see a good day and a bad day and a good transition and a tough one, and all of those things. So the nuance of those evaluations, and of course we're biased, is something that we're proud of. So on to, we call it OHI, so you'll hear that a lot, OHI, and that's otherwise health impaired is another evaluation that we often do. This is one where you have a medical diagnosis and we've measured that there's an impact in school. And usually that's done by observations, some academic assessment, sometimes an IQ test, depending on what the concern is. So again, like Krista said, this is most frequently used for kids who, we see it most often for like ADHD. Again, where a medical diagnosis of ADHD doesn't guarantee that you're going to meet the threshold of the need for special ed. There are some other laws and things in place that would provide for plans and supports and accommodations to be made if you don't quite meet that level. And that's called Section 504. So you might have heard that before as well. And that sometimes takes care of some of those needs for, say, like extra time on tests or extended time to return assignments or things like that. That, you know, don't necessarily need to be like a whole IEP, but will help a learner who thinks differently. What else did I miss? What other,
And
oh,
OHI can be like seizure disorders.
Mhm.
I see a lot. That's probably the second most common. Or sometimes diabetes will have some impact, and that's another one. And then just, you know, some of the more rare medical disorders. Sometimes things like chemotherapy, kids that have been through chemo and stuff like that. I would say if you are teaching in a K through 12 setting, you will see mostly specific learning disability in OHI.
that's fair.
It's
Not my world, but
no,
that's
but
fair.
that
Yeah.
K through 12, most of you,
Mhm.
I'm guessing, are going to end up teaching there. That's what you will see the most.
And then we have ECDD, which is early childhood developmental delay, which means we've evaluated for a few other things. There are specific rule outs in that law, meaning that it's not a cognitive impairment. It's not necessarily rising to the level of meeting autism criteria. So we've ruled out a bunch of other things, but we measure still that there's a problem and a school need. So the way that you qualify for early childhood developmental delay is that somewhere in your assessment, you have a skill that measures, and this is my least favorite part about early childhood developmental delay, you have a skill that's at half of your age expected development, meaning that if you're 5 years and 0 months, some skill that we're measuring along the way during our assessment has an age equivalent of 2.5 or lower. So that could happen on an IQ test, that could happen on like a speech test of expressive receptive language, that could happen on, and it most frequently happens on our rating scales of adaptive behavior. So those things that measure self-care, self-help, those daily living skills, and pick up a lot of those needs that happen across the day. So very often children will come with this eligibility and then later qualify for something else. So this allows us, you know, we can't evaluate for, say, a learning disability when a child is 5 and they're still in preschool because they haven't been exposed to good reading, writing, and math curriculum yet. So it's not possible to say that they haven't made progress in it.
And they have to test out, but they can't be under that eligibility by age 8.
Yes.
So before they turn 8, we have to reevaluate and see if they
Right.
qualify in another way.
So,
or if they need
yeah.
services.
That eligibility will expire at a child's 8th birthday. So through age 7, that applies. So it'll force another evaluation when a kid has been in elementary school, you know, usually that's 1st, 2nd grade. And that gives us some time to intervene, and then we can go back and look at what that profile looks like now that that kid has been exposed to some curriculum and has had some chances to make some progress and receive some intervention. I think the only one I didn't talk about was EI. So that's emotional impairment, and that one needs to be evaluated by a psychologist and a social worker, again, because we're dipping into that emotional behavioral domain. And so there are a variety of ways we do that. A lot of that, again, is observation, team interviews, rating scales. We might want to measure academic impact with academic testing. And so there's a set criteria that we look at for EI. It's things like inappropriate behavior under normal circumstances, difficulty forming relationships with school personnel, a feeling of sadness or unhappiness pervasively. There's one more.
Developing like physical symptoms or wanting to be absent from school frequently because of things like anxiety, like mental illness related.
Right.
Kids that can't form peer relationships and staff relationships.
So these will be kids with behavior concerns who truly do not appear to be in control of their behavior. I think that's it for areas of eligibility.
The only other one I think that I've done a handful of
TBI.
times is,
Yeah.
traumatic brain injury. It's not common, but for those kids that, have had brain injuries, we would be doing that flow comprehensive assessment, kind of similar to like an OHI. You would be looking at IQ and on-task behavior and just a variety of different things can be impacted by a traumatic brain injury. So that is, a very comprehensive evaluation. And then we also need that medical piece if there was brain injury. But you don't see it too often.
No, once every couple of years.
Yeah, pretty much.
But again, the bread and butter is the SLD and the OHI
Yeah,
mostly. Mhm.
yep. And I would say those evaluations are complex. All of these are very complex. So I think the next thing we want to talk about is all of the things that we're going to do for those evaluations and all of the things we're going to ask of you to help with those evaluations.
So we're going to give you a peek at those instruments, and we'll pause the camera and grab some of those, and we'll be right back. So
All right, guys, that was quite a bit of information. Do you have some questions that you want to ask now, or do you want to wait until we're done?
I have a question about the ECDD.
Mhm.
Is it 3 to 8?
Yes. And so it has to be redetermined before their 8th birthday.
So every 3 years, it doesn't have to be reevaluated every year, every 3 years? Or
A better
does?
way to look at it, well, it would depend on when they did the eval that found them ECDD. You know what I'm saying? Like it could occur that it was their 3-year MET that causes the team to reevaluate. But let's say, for whatever reason, it didn't happen until they were 6 and there was not a better eligibility area, then they wouldn't have the full 3 years to do it. Most of the time I do see that it happens around the age of like 4 or 5 as they're getting ready to go to kindergarten. It usually falls then, so that the timing is exactly like you described. By the time it's due, the 3-year reevaluation is due, it coincides with that eligibility area, the clock running out. You've got to look at other things. Almost always, but not 100%.
Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. That one is always confusing. I think lots of people have questions about that one. All right, we're on video 3. I think the one we just watched is the longest one. The rest are considerably shorter. So let's look at video 3.
So here we have an IQ test, or parts of an IQ test. This is one of the few proprietary things where I can't get out the whole test kit and show you. It's a super secret. But what's great about an IQ test, and nothing is perfect in terms of being able to measure things cleanly, especially in a school environment where there's lots of stuff going on. But an IQ test is the closest we could get. So besides the fact that there are a variety of eligibilities that require or could use an IQ test as part of our determination, what it also lets us do is measure our different skills as close to in a vacuum as we can. So this is a verbal task. This is a visual task. This is a problem solving task. Now we're testing memory. Now we're testing processing speed. And each of those things are scored individually as well as an overall IQ score. So what that does is allows us to look at a student's own performance and see what rises and falls compared to their own skills. So we call that ipsative comparison. So comparing to yourself, and we learn a lot of things wow, a student really needs more processing time than we thought. They're really slow processors when we measure and compare to other kids their age. or oh, look at the difference between their verbal IQ and some of their visual processing. Look, that's really why visuals are so important for this student. Their visual processing is just so much better developed. So again, some useful things for instruction often come out of an IQ test. So
Yeah, for kids with say ADHD, a lot of times we see that short-term memory is impacted. For kids with autism, oftentimes their processing is slower. Or there are those kids that just have a lower IQ. They're not necessarily cognitively impaired, but they are going to need a lot of repetition to learn. And sometimes I think that information is needed for parents and teachers to hear, like, oh, you're not doing anything wrong, but honestly, this kid is just going to need that many more repetitions than a kid with an average IQ.
and that's one of the things that research strongly links is that the need for multiple opportunities to learn multiple repetitions is associated with a lower IQ.
Yeah.
So, and I can show you just one part that is the classic IQ test thing. This is the first thing we do is these here blocks. So, you know, we say, see these blocks? They're all alike. On some sides, they're all red. On some sides, they're all white. And on some sides, they're half red and half white. Watch me put these blocks together. And then you make a pattern. You're looking at replicating those patterns. As you can tell, one thing about an IQ test is that it's very rote. There are things you have to say.
Remember,
Right? There are things you have to say the same way every time. And there are things you can't help with. And so sometimes that's frustrating for kids because it is a little bit more strict than, you know, any other thing they're going to encounter in their school day in terms of what the parameters are. And you do feel a little bit like a robot reading, but, you know, we try and make it fun.
Yeah,
So.
yeah. We do it quick. The last thing are just those standardized academic tests that we give one-on-one with students. So it's not like we give them a piece of paper and they take a test. This is a one-on-one assessment where we're asking them questions constantly. It's interactive. So it's a pretty lengthy battery. And typically, you know, when we are looking at a learning issue in the classroom, we will be looking at all areas of learning. Even if we're not looking for a specific learning disability, we'll most likely be assessing, you know, all the different areas of reading and math and writing. And so you'll see subtests called word reading, alphabet writing fluency, reading comprehension, math problem solving, sentence composition, oral reading fluency, essay composition, pseudo word or nonsense word decoding, numerical operations, which is math calculation, decoding, fluency, spelling, and then depending on the question, you might see some additional like phonological awareness assessments thrown in there. You might see listening comprehension and oral expression as well, depending on, you know, the concern. So it's quite a battery, and that in the end, if we give an IQ test, those are the bulk of our direct assessments and why we would be pulling your students from class. And in advance, we all thank you for letting us pull your students from class. And we have crazy schedules and often do not know exactly when we will be pulling. And we appreciate all of your flexibility with that. In advance, from any school psychologist you work with, we appreciate that.
We will do our best to give you notice, but, you know, with absences and crazy caseloads and all sorts of stuff, sometimes we're flying by the seat of our pants, just like the rest of you.
Yep. So just a heads up on that.
Okay. One more.
All right, guys, any questions from that video?
No?
Okay.
Here with me, part of an ADOS, because the whole ADOS itself is like a giant, huge tub. And the reason for that is the way that you decide which parts of an ADOS to give.
Play with us again.
the autism diagnostic observation schedule. So the reason you pick one ADOS module over the others, there are 5. There used to be 4, but now there are 5. Is the amount of speech that you hear from a student. So there's a toddler module for your very, very young kids. And then there's module 1 for if you hear like just a little bit of speech. So it says pre-verbal single words. And then phrase speech. And then there's one for kids who communicate in sentences. And then the last module is for like adolescents. So the changes are huge between each module, although there's a little bit of overlap. So for example, module 1 is a lot more like play. So here's our protocol that we use. And everyone who evaluates with me will tell you I treat these like gold because they're like, I don't know, they're like $45 a piece. So, you know, there's only one that we write on. Nobody else, we can all look at them for our questions, but nobody else needs to be writing on these. And so what they do is they go through the play schedule of like what we're going to be doing. We're going to do some free play. We're going to call their name and see if they respond. Some of those kinds of things, and allows us to take some notes. And then once we're done with the play activities with the child, we go through and we do some coding of the behaviors that we saw. It's funny because a lot of these different items on here, although we kind of really debate about how to code them. So they're coded usually as 0, 1, or 2, or 3 as to, and it's pretty clear about, you know, which behaviors would fall under each category. But many of those don't end up loading onto there's like, I don't know, there's like 50 questions and then 15 of them we use for the score.
And that's not anything
no.
that they would be filling out
No.
with.
And it
What
might,
you would be filling out.
yes, it's so what the team fills out. So I facilitate that conversation. But so you can get a little bit of an idea of what we're talking about when we talk about play materials. This is my favorite example when I explain to families about what's strange about an ADOS and what it's going to look like. Like, although we're getting out a ton of different materials that are meant to elicit communication and social behavior in kids. So for example, I have a bubble fish, like so, and I will say like, you know, 1, 2, and then I wait. And I want to hear 3, go, or something that says like go, and then the bubbles come. So you can see that like therapeutically when you're interacting with kids, you would meet them 75% of the way with support to get that verbal response that you want. But during an ADOS, you're really looking at when the onus is on the child for communication. What skills do they have? You know, what problem solving communication skills, those kinds of things. Another good example of this is there's a snack time. So here's my snack container, and it is evilly designed to be difficult to open. It's very difficult to open. So I have it filled with something that I know the kid likes. So I've done my homework about that. I never feed a kid unless I know about their allergies. So I usually have like Oreos or fruit snacks or something in here, like the little Oreos. And I'll say, it's snack time. And I'll just put that there. And then I'll wait. And I'll see what happens. So are they requesting? Are they taking my hand and putting it on here? Are they trying to open it themselves? And if I do get a good request, I'll open it up and I'll give them 1. And then I'll wait. So some of those things we're really looking at, you know, it's kind of artificial in that we don't usually interact with kids like that, but we're setting up those opportunities to look at those requesting and those joint attention behaviors, which we later grade for. So a few more things that are part of the activity. So here's a picture book that's almost all pictures. So we'll read it together and we'll say, you know, I'll do the first few pages and this happens and that happens. And then, oh, look, what's happening now? And then I'll turn it here and I want to hear, you know, what do they have to describe the picture and what gestures are they making and how is their eye contact while we're reading the story together? So there's a variety of things like that, depending on the level of the student. Those are some of the ones for earlier kids, which honestly is stuff that we use more often. Once we get into phrase speech, or once we get into the full sentence speech, it gets kind of more interview style. So you might be asking kids, or I might be asking kids things like, what does it mean to have a friend? And
Do you ever feel lonely?
oh, I hate that question.
Where do you want to live someday?
Would you like to get married?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's very interesting.
Yeah, you get a lot of interesting questions, and it's hard, especially for those kids who might have autism but are pretty verbally well developed by the time they're pretty young. Those are difficult. So
They give you.
I know.
I want to live alone in the desert in the ground. Okay.
All right. I'll never forget. What's the best thing about being married? What would be nice about being married someday? Snuggling.
It's so cute.
Yeah, yeah. So that's fun. So that's the ADOS. And what's next?
Okay, so some of the awesome rating skills that you are going to see, and they're going to be very important to these evaluations. I'll begin with this one. This is the ABAS, so it's the Adaptive Behavior Assessment System. And so these are really important for those cognitive impairment evaluations, the autism evaluations, and it's going to look at those everyday living skills, those functional skills. It is very, these are very lengthy. Sorry. Sorry about that. And the directions, it's really important to read the directions carefully because the scoring on these really relies on what the student can do independently. So you're scoring it based on how, if they can do it, how often they do it, and that's without reminders and without help. So that's where sometimes people rate the kids higher than they really are because they're thinking, oh yeah, so-and-so, you know, knows what supplies to bring to class, but then they think, oh, well, that's because, you know, their aide is helping them do that at their locker. So it's just, that's really important to read those directions carefully. And there are just several, just lots of areas and items that you'll have to complete and fill out. And we do recognize that it does take time for teachers to do this and it's lengthy, but I want you to know these are just so important. We need that. This is eligibility criteria. So, you know, we will bother you and beg you for these. So yeah, these are all the different areas that we're going to be looking at. So things like communication and community use and functional academics, school living skills, health and safety, leisure, self-care, self-direction, social. So it just covers all those areas of functional skills. Very important. Another adaptive behavior skill that you might see is the Vineland. There's a shortened version of this, which you might have a school psychologist that is, you know, just wonderful and gives you that short version, but I usually don't because I usually want more information. So the comprehensive form again is, you know, you read the directions carefully. This one is a little different than the ABAS, but it pretty much measures the same things. So again, it's, you know, something that's important for eligibility or for some of our students, it's just important information that, you know, we need for educational programming. What areas do we need to focus on? You know, is it more social or is it more just like community use? We need to talk about starting to carry some money with them, starting to understand, you know, what I do when I go in a store, that kind of thing. So those are really important, but they are the lengthiest rating skills that you will see is for that adaptive.
And the cool part of that is that there's a parent complement as well. So a lot of parents say, you know, oh, so-and-so does this at home perfectly and so-and-so doesn't do this at school. And it's a nice way to kind of put some numbers on that conversation to frame it. Like, oh, look, self-direction is much better developed at home than it is at school. What is it about those environments that are different? And I always tell people too that, you know, individual ratings reflect individual perspectives as well as different environments. So again, it's just a jumping off point with some kind of hard data to have conversations about what we're seeing in different environments and when different demands are placed on a student.
Yeah, thank you. And I just thought of something as well. These are standardized assessments. And what that means is that we can compare the child's performance to other children their age. And so that's what we're getting out of these is that information.
And to themselves over time.
Yeah.
So, you know, we're comparing them to a child within a few months of their age every time we do it. So we might see things kind of hold steady, or we might see some skills drop off or improve. So it's nice to be able to gather that data over multiple different testing sessions or different testing opportunities.
Yep, absolutely. This is a behavior assessment. You will most likely encounter this. It's very common. The DASD, the VAS, it's the behavior assessment system for children. It assesses everything from anxiety, depression, to things like hyperactivity and attention. It does have some of those adaptive skills built into this as well. It's just much more brief. I give these with every evaluation. I give them for every single one, but definitely these would be a part of, you know, an emotional impairment evaluation or an autism evaluation where we're specifically focused on behavior. I include them for learning disabilities and stuff as well, because you never know, you know, what's really impacting. I want to make sure that I have that whole picture of how the student's functioning. I should grab a pen.
Yeah, the way I explain that to parents often is like, oh, we're doing an autism evaluation, but we want to make sure that we're picking the right behaviors. So we need a behavior lineup of all of the different things that could be a concern for a child that age so that we're not missing something. So for example, I might be doing an autism evaluation where on that specific scale, it doesn't say like autism, it says atypicality. And I always laugh because it's a super vague rating scale and it says things like, does strange things, never, sometimes, often, always. Well, it depends on what you think is strange. So it kind of casts a wide net over anything that might be a concern. And when we score it up, this is one that's computer scored. So it'll kick us back out like a report that says, these are action items or these are items of concern. And these are the specific items that spiked this score. Another thing to note is that often, for whatever reason, behavior rating scales are not done with the same scoring metric that almost everything else is done on. So you'll see standard scores where average scores are between 85 and 115 on the adaptive rating scale she just showed you, as well as the IQ test, whereas on a BASC, they're called T-scores. And that's, you know, scores within a certain range are typical for a kid of that age. Then we have like a getting elevated, so we call that at risk. And then we have a clinically significant concern. So, you know, the metric is a little bit different because the behavior we're talking about is a little bit different.
Yeah, and it should be in your psychologist report.
Right. But just so you understand, you know, 60 on an IQ test is low, but 60 on a behavior rating scale is just kind of elevated into a concern. So it's one of those where I kind of go out of my way to say, oh, we're using a different yardstick when we're measuring this. And sometimes I color code or do things like that, just so everybody understands we're talking about something a little different.
Yeah. The other one you might see for behavior that's very common, that's specific to ADHD or more oppositional behaviors is the Connors. It's not exceptionally long, but you'll see it's very specific to the inattention, the hyperactivity, impulsivity, and arguing and defiance and things like that. So that is often, and you'll see that maybe sometimes from doctors too. Mm-hmm. If a parent has concerns about ADHD and they talk to their pediatrician about it, the pediatrician might say, okay, have your teacher, you know, fill out a Connors. So you'll see that too.
Here's my bars. So this is, it's a Gilliam autism rating scale. And so for this one, it's specific to autism and it's well beyond like the eligibility or diagnostic criteria that we would be looking at. So it's a variety of different things that might be related to autism and specific behaviors. So as well as the restricted behaviors that we talked about that we use for eligibility, as well as that social interaction and communication pieces, it also looks at emotional responses. So big emotional responses that don't seem to fit the situation, cognitive styles, so a lack of flexibility and some problem solving and thinking about things, and maladaptive speech. So there are common speech errors that we sometimes hear with people with autism, and it's asking about those things. All right, we're going to stop this so we can grab some of the assessment materials that we use for those direct assessments.
Okay, guys, how you feeling? Questions? Comments?
Not so much a question, but it's kind of a comment that okay, I'm trying to write like the notes on these things that I'm more of a visual learner and I can't see what they're kind of thing. So I'm trying to write down as fast as I can. I'm having a hard time hearing what assessments they're actually talking about.
Gotcha. Well, I'm recording this and we'll upload all the entire video into one video and then share that with the class as a YouTube video. So you can go back and look at that if you'd like to. And it's okay if you don't like write, long notes on each assessment. The takeaway is that there are specific assessments that the psychologist is going to use that are aligned to what the concern was, the reason for the referral, that also align to eligibility areas. Like there's specific assessments for autism evals. There's specific ones for EI evals. There's specific ones for specific learning disability, et cetera, et cetera. And so if you're able to jot some notes about examples included, the ADOS for autism, the Connors for ADHD, things like that. That's going to be helpful to you, especially when you get into the classroom. So I'm exposing you to this information now because when you're in the classroom, you will be a part of evaluations and you'll get a copy of that psychologist report. And I want you to be able to understand it when you're reading it and know why they gave the test they gave, why they're giving you rating scales, how that's helping them make that eligibility determination. Things like that are going to be so much more beneficial to you if you understand what exactly is included in those reports and why, and what your role is with that. And depending on where you are district-wise, there may be times when you are actually giving some of the assessments. Each district does things a little bit differently. So examples would be achievement testing. In some districts, the special ed teacher administers those, not the psychologist. So just be aware of that.
I have a quick question. What did the ADOS assessment stand for?
Autism Diagnostic Observation Schedule.
Thank you.
You bet.
Okay. So we just wanted to go over the timeline process for the evaluation really quickly. So once you put in a referral, the school psychologist, will quickly draw up paperwork that the parent will have to sign for the evaluation, or the parent will make a request and we have an actual timeline of 10 school days to get that paperwork home and offer our evaluation plan. So we'll be asking you, for your input as part of that and any data that you might have.
That's called a review of existing educational documents. So we go through the file and we pull out what we can use, background information. So what that is basically is it says, here's what we know about a student. And because of all of this, here is our testing plan. So it makes the case for the evaluation based on what we know. It sets up the evaluation and then becomes the permission form for testing.
Yep. And it's off in the packet that I send with the rating scales, or we meet with the family and have more of a formal meeting and get the signature at that time. So then once we have the signature, we have 30 school days to complete the evaluation. And by the 30 school days, we have to have an IEP meeting, so an individual education plan meeting. Prior to that, depending on what eligibility we're considering, we would need to have what's called a MET team meeting. So the MET team is the multidisciplinary evaluation team. That's the people that have been part of that team, including yourself. So we might have to set up, formal meetings to go over that criteria, such as with autism or emotional impairment, something like that. But sometimes it's just the school psychologist and, yourself, and we don't have to make that anything formal. And prior to, the IEP meeting, best practice, and I know Camille and I always do it, is contacting the parent and letting them know, okay, this is our MET team recommendation for eligibility, and we'll be discussing, that at this IEP meeting, and then the IEP team will make that final decision regarding eligibility, and then we can talk about the plan for your child moving forward.
Based on what we learned.
Yep. So that's kind of our process from beginning to end. And I hope that what we provided today was useful to you. And we'll be available, if there are follow-up questions, we're happy to provide answers. Okay.
Absolutely.
All right. Thanks, guys.
Okay, guys, that was an extremely thorough beginning to end walkthrough from the perspective of a school psychologist. And I realize if you're not currently living and breathing in a special ed classroom and you haven't done this a few times, that might have seemed like Greek and a little bit overwhelming. So think about what questions you have. And you can either ask now, or you can put that in an email and send it to me and let me know, like, these are the topics that I would like more information about. And either I can bring that to you, or if we need to bring Camille and Krista back so that you hear it straight out of the mouth of a school psych, that's fine. Or if you want to hear like from a speech pathologist or a social worker, other folks that might be involved with doing evals, that could be arranged as well. But just know, I want you to feel comfortable with the content. So I'm not trying to overwhelm you, just trying to give you the information that's going to be relevant as a special education teacher. Everything they talked about is real life. Those things actually happen. And it will be part of your at least monthly world that you're being talked to about. This kid has a read open. Can you get your present level in on this? Talk to this mom about, possible OHI eligibility. Can you fill out the cars for me? Those things happen regularly, as well as being aware of what those timelines are. Those can be pretty critical in the world of special education. So, do you have any questions right now, or do you need to process and send me emails as to questions or need for clarity?
I have a question about the timeline.
Mhm.
If the teacher makes the referral, the 10 days timeline is if a parent makes.
Right. And the rule around that is if a parent wants their child to be evaluated and they're saying, let's say, I think my kid has autism, or such and so clinic says they do, I want services, I want a full eval. First of all, it needs to be in writing. So they need to draft an email or some sort of documentation that puts it in writing. And from that date that it's received by the school, there are 10 school days by which the school needs to respond. So not that you have to have the IEP and the eval done. The school needs to make a response in the form of, like a read, so that you're saying, and the read response can be, the team has evaluated all existing data, and there is no educational impact. And here's the data about that. Here's the last district assessment. Here's the last 2 M steps, that sort of thing. So that's possible. So it's possible that a child can have a medical diagnosis, but not a school eligibility. But basically, in essence, we have 10 school days if a parent puts it in writing to give them some sort of response. What's our plan? And if you're not evaluating, why not?
And then the 30 days,
So that's from when the read is signed. So the read is an actual document that says we're recommending an evaluation. Here's what we know, here's what we don't know, and here's how we're going to assess your child to answer those questions that we don't know. And mom or dad or both need to sign that. You have to have written parent permission to pursue that evaluation. If it's divorced parents, you only need one parent's signature, but you should always, always make both parents aware of what you're doing. And once it's signed, whatever date that parent signs that read, you have 30 school days. So weekends aren't counted, snow days aren't counted, holidays aren't counted, PD days are not counted, that kind of a thing.
Okay. So when it's the offer of FAPE, is that school days or calendar days?
That's also school days. So what she's talking about is at the IEP itself, the school makes an offer of a free and appropriate public education. That's what the IEP is essentially saying. Here's our district offer of a free and appropriate public education in the least restrictive environment for your child. Sometimes parents will say, I need to think about this a little bit. So, but you only have 10 school days from the time that IEP was held to implementing it. Otherwise, you have to start all over. And nobody wants that. So, yeah. Other questions? I'd love to know what you thought of that. Was that helpful? I mean, is that something we should include in this class moving forward, or it wasn't really helpful? And sorry about the mask. I hate the whole, we keep having to mask, but that's, that's the way it goes. I think though, if I share the whole thing as one video from this recording, it will be easier for you guys to understand everything that they're saying and presenting.
I think it was really helpful. I think just not being in a classroom yet, being like first semester, was a bit overwhelming, but I learned quite a lot. And I think they just talk really fast. I'm gonna have to go back over and rewatch the video, but I think it was really helpful.
Yeah, I would love to have had something like that, because I mean, my discipline and training was in speech language pathology, so I knew my own little world very well. But walking into school, the school environment, I was so unfamiliar with the tests that other disciplines used. So I thought it would be helpful for you guys to have a better understanding of what school psychologists do and how they make that determination of eligibility.
I thought it was very good. I feel like when you get to a school district, though, sometimes you need to kind of adapt to what they do and their special ed director, because unfortunately it's not scripted to one thing. I mean, obviously they have to meet the state requirements, so on and so forth. But the biggest thing that drives me nuts is I wish the whole state of Michigan had one IEP. One IEP you fill out, done and over with. Because I'm sorry, I get them from other schools, and some of them are like, you're reading French, trying to read through the IEP to actually pick out one, what's the child's problem, what's test scores,
I agree. About 11 years ago, the state did have an electronic IEP system, and then they quit. They, stopped doing it. And that's when, the other companies kind of took over the market. And now we have multiple different electronic platforms.
Yeah, I think that's very hard.
It is. Any other comments, questions, or feedback for me? All right. Well,
I just
go ahead.
I had a question of the notes. When are the notes due again? Are they due tonight or are they due
No, I think
October?
Yeah, I think they're due like October 10th. You have some time. Yeah, because I doubt that I'll even have a chance to get this downloaded from Zoom, because Zoom takes a while to convert these videos in the first place. And then getting it uploaded to YouTube is like another hour or two. So chances are it won't be shared out until tomorrow. And I think you have until the 10th to submit notes. Shane, did you have another comment? Nope. All right. Well, if you guys think of anything, just send me an email or text me. And if I don't know, I'll find it out for you. Okay? All
Thank
right.
you.
You bet. Have a great night,
Thank
guys.
you.
Mhm.
Thanks. Have a great night.
Thank you.